There is a concept in physics called the tipping point, the precise moment at which a system that has been under increasing pressure suddenly shifts from one state to another, irreversibly and often violently. A glass balanced on the edge of a table, a dam holding back years of accumulated water, a fault line absorbing decades of geological tension. The pressure builds gradually, invisibly, in ways that look manageable from the outside. And then one thing changes, one final increment of pressure, one small shift in the balance. And the system does not gradually adjust. It breaks, and what was balanced becomes something entirely different, with no straightforward path back to what it was. That is the concept I want you to hold in your mind for the next 15 minutes, because it describes precisely where this conflict stands right now. Not at the beginning of escalation, not in the middle of it. At the tipping point, the moment where one decision, made by one actor, in one of several possible directions, determines whether this situation remains in the category of manageable crisis or crosses into the category of something that the international system does not have the tools to reverse. My name is Professor Jiang Xueqin, and if you want to understand the architecture of that tipping point, what created it, who controls it, and what the realistic outcomes of crossing it look like, please like this video and subscribe to this channel right now, because this is the structural analysis that the news cycle cannot give you, and that this moment absolutely requires. In this video, we are going to answer 3 precise questions. What is a geopolitical tipping point structurally, and what specific combination of factors has brought this conflict to one right now? Who are the decisive actors whose decisions will determine which side of the tipping point the situation lands on, and what is the real logic driving their calculations beneath the public statements? And from this point forward, what are the realistic scenarios? The path on which the tipping point is crossed in a direction that produces uncontrolled escalation, the path on which it is navigated with the kind of precise, coordinated judgment that crisis management requires, and the strategic wildcard that could reframe the entire situation before the decisive decision is made. By the end of this video, you will understand not just this specific tipping point, but the framework for identifying and interpreting tipping points in major conflicts before they are crossed, while there is still time for the analysis to matter. Let us begin with the context reset, because understanding a tipping point requires understanding the pressure that built up to it. And the pressure in this conflict has been building through a very specific sequence of developments that the news cycle has covered individually without connecting into the cumulative picture they constitute. The headline at any given moment has been about the most recent development, the latest strike, the latest diplomatic statement, the latest weapons announcement. What the headline has not been about is the architecture of cumulative pressure that each of those developments has added to, and the point at which that cumulative pressure reaches the threshold where the system's capacity to absorb it without fundamental change is exhausted. That threshold is where this conflict now stands. Here is what has literally just happened that has brought the situation to this specific tipping point. Over the course of the last several weeks, a sequence of decisions and developments, each individually calibrated to stay within the established range of the conflict's conduct, has cumulatively moved the situation to a point where the next significant decision, whichever actor makes it and in whichever direction it goes, cannot be processed by the conflict's existing management architecture as a variation within the established pattern. It will be processed as a departure from that pattern. And departures from the established pattern of a major conflict at the stage of cumulative pressure that this one has reached do not produce marginal adjustments. They produce threshold changes. Changes that are qualitatively different from everything that preceded them and that create new facts on the ground that reshape the decision-making environment for all subsequent actors. The specific developments that have created the tipping point are visible to anyone applying the right analytical framework. The first is the near-complete exhaustion of the diplomatic space that has historically provided a release valve for escalatory pressure in this conflict. The back-channel communication architecture, the informal understandings, the intermediary relationships, the ambiguous diplomatic formulations that have allowed each side to step back from the edge without explicitly acknowledging that it was doing so, has degraded to a point where it can no longer perform that function reliably. The trust deficit between the primary parties and their external supporters has accumulated to a level that makes the informal understandings that the communication architecture depends on increasingly difficult to construct and increasingly fragile when constructed. The second is the convergence of domestic political pressure across multiple key actors simultaneously, a convergence in which each actor's internal political situation is making the posture of restraint that conflict management requires harder to sustain at precisely the moment when sustained restraint is most needed. And the third is the specific military development that has occurred on the ground, a development that has moved the conflict's operational reality to a point where the status quo ante is no longer militarily or politically sustainable for at least one of the primary parties, which means that a significant decision is not optional. It is compelled. The question is only what form it takes. The prior context that makes this specific tipping point more dangerous than earlier near-threshold moments in this conflict is the cumulative depletion of the resources that crisis management requires. Crisis management at the tipping point of a major conflict requires three things simultaneously: reliable communication channels between the key decision makers, sufficient domestic political latitude for those decision makers to accept the short-term costs of de-escalatory choices, and a credible framework of mutual interest in avoiding the worst outcomes that gives each actor a structural reason to exercise restraint, even when the immediate pressures point toward escalation. All three of those resources have been depleted by the conflict's duration and intensity. The communication channels are degraded. The domestic political latitude is constrained, and the framework of mutual interest in avoiding worst outcomes has been complicated by the accumulation of commitments, grievances, and precedents that makes the calculus of restraint less straightforward than it was at earlier moments in the conflict. At a tipping point, the system is more sensitive to the quality of decision-making than at any earlier stage, and the decision-making environment has never been less favorable to the quality that is required. The media narrative is covering the current moment through the framework it has applied throughout the conflict, as a sequence of developments, each significant in itself, each requiring a response, each manageable within the existing framework. What the media narrative is missing is the tipping point structure, the specific way in which the cumulative weight of those developments has moved the situation to a threshold where the analytical framework that has been adequate until now is no longer adequate. Tipping points are by definition invisible from inside the frameworks that have been used to manage the pressure leading up to them. Recognizing them requires stepping outside those frameworks and assessing the system's overall state rather than the significance of any individual development. That is the analytical task this video is designed to perform. Now let us build the power map, because the tipping point is ultimately a product of actor decisions, and understanding who controls the decisive decisions and what their real calculus looks like is the foundation of everything that follows. Start with the primary party that faces the most immediate and compelled decision. Publicly, it is projecting resolve, strategic confidence, and a commitment to continue pursuing its defined objectives through the means available to it. Strategically, what it actually faces is a decision that its military and political situation has made unavoidable. A decision between a course of action that accepts significant short-term cost in exchange for avoiding the tipping point, and a course of action that pursues immediate military or political advantage at the risk of crossing it. The internal deliberation driving that decision is not primarily about strategic logic in the abstract. It is about the political survival of the leadership making it, because at this stage of the conflict, the leaders making the critical decisions are doing so in domestic political environments where the cost of a decision that looks like weakness may be higher than the cost of a decision that risks escalation. That asymmetry, where the domestic political cost of restraint exceeds the domestic political cost of escalation, is one of the most dangerous structural features of a tipping point, because it means the decision-making incentives of the actors most directly controlling the outcome are not aligned with the outcomes that de-escalation requires. Look at the United States. Publicly, Washington is maintaining the posture of engaged management, projecting involvement, demonstrating commitment to its partners, and signaling awareness of the escalation risk without communicating a specific assessment of how close the situation is to the tipping point. Strategically, what the United States actually needs at this specific moment is a combination of two things that are in partial tension with each other: a clear and credible communication to all parties about the consequences of crossing the tipping point, and a simultaneous communication of the specific terms on which a de-escalatory path is available and supported. The first communication without the second is pure deterrence. It raises the cost of crossing the tipping point without providing an alternative. The second, without the first, is an invitation to test the credibility of the deterrence. Both are needed simultaneously, and delivering both simultaneously requires a degree of diplomatic precision and political coherence that the current domestic political environment in Washington makes genuinely difficult to sustain. The biggest constraint on the United States is therefore not its military capacity or its intelligence picture. It is the coherence of its political signaling at a moment when the decision-making environment requires signals of exceptional clarity. Look at Russia. At the tipping point of a conflict in which Russia is a major external actor, its decision calculus is driven by a specific assessment. How close is the situation to producing an outcome that falls below Russia's minimum acceptable threshold? And is the risk of crossing the tipping point in the direction of escalation preferable to the risk of the conflict resolving in a way that falls below that threshold? Russia's minimum acceptable outcome in this conflict has been consistently defined, explicitly and implicitly, as one that prevents the consolidation of a hostile military and political architecture on Russia's strategic periphery. If the trajectory of the conflict appears to be moving toward that outcome, despite everything Russia has done to prevent it, the tipping point calculus shifts in the direction of escalation, because the cost of the unacceptable outcome is assessed as higher than the cost of crossing the tipping point. Understanding where Russia's assessment of trajectory currently sits is therefore the most critical intelligence question in the current moment, and it is the question on which the analytical community has the most significant uncertainty. Look at China, because its role at the tipping point is more active and more consequential than its public posture suggests. China is the actor with the most significant capacity to influence the tipping point dynamic without itself crossing any threshold that would trigger a direct Western response. It can deepen or restrict its economic support for Russia in ways that affect Russia's trajectory assessment without constituting direct military involvement. It can engage or withhold the kind of high-level diplomatic communication that could influence the decision-making of multiple parties simultaneously. And it can signal its own red lines with respect to conflict outcomes in ways that either widen or narrow the space available for the other actors' decisions. China's decision about how to use that capacity at the tipping point is itself one of the most consequential decisions in the current moment, and it is being made within a strategic framework that values both stability and the demonstration that American-led crisis management is not reliably effective. Those two values point in different directions at a tipping point, and the direction China chooses will significantly shape the outcome. Look at the European allies, because their coherence and commitment at the tipping point is a structural variable that all other actors are assessing and factoring into their own calculations. A unified European position that clearly communicates the costs of crossing the tipping point in the escalatory direction, and that demonstrates the political capacity to sustain those costs, is a meaningful contribution to tipping point management. A fragmented European position that reveals the limits of Allied coherence under pressure is a contribution in the opposite direction, because it signals to every actor contemplating escalation that the consequences will be borne by a coalition whose internal divisions can be exploited. The current state of European political coherence under pressure from domestic political changes in several key member states and from the economic costs of sustained conflict support is more fragile than the public posture of the European institutions suggests, and that fragility is visible to the actors whose decisions the European position is meant to influence. Now let us turn to the structural facts, the hard realities that define what the tipping point actually is, what crossing it would produce, and what the management requirements are. Structural fact number one, tipping points in major conflicts are defined not by the magnitude of the triggering decision, but by the state of the system at the moment the decision is made. A decision that would have been manageable within the conflict's existing framework at an earlier stage, a particular military action, a particular weapons deployment, a particular public statement, becomes a tipping point trigger when the cumulative state of the system has reached the threshold at which its management capacity is exhausted. This means that the danger of the current moment cannot be assessed by looking at the magnitude of the decisions being contemplated in isolation. It requires assessing the cumulative state of the system, the depletion of communication channels, the exhaustion of domestic political latitude, the degradation of mutual interest frameworks, and comparing that state to the management requirements of the decisions that are now unavoidable. The assessment that emerges from that comparison is what makes the current moment genuinely different from earlier near-threshold moments in this conflict. Structural fact number two, The speed of escalation after a tipping point is crossed is determined by the degree to which the management architecture has been depleted before crossing. A conflict system with robust communication channels, significant domestic political latitude, and strong mutual interest frameworks can cross a tipping point and recover. The escalation is managed, the communication channels absorb the pressure, and a new equilibrium is established at a higher but still manageable level. A conflict system with depleted communication channels, constrained domestic political latitude, and degraded mutual interest frameworks crosses a tipping point and cascades. Each response generates a counter-response that the depleted management architecture cannot absorb, and the situation moves rapidly through levels of intensity that would have been considered threshold events at any earlier stage. The current state of this conflict's management architecture is significantly closer to the depleted end of that spectrum than the robust end, which means that if the tipping point is crossed in the escalatory direction, the speed and depth of the subsequent escalation is likely to exceed the most common analytical projections. Structural fact number 3. The decision that crosses a tipping point is almost never recognized as the tipping point decision by the actor making it at the moment it is made. Tipping points are identified retrospectively. Historians and analysts look back at the sequence of events and identify the specific decision that shifted the system from one state to another. At the moment of decision, the actor making it is processing it within the analytical framework that has governed its decision-making throughout the conflict. A framework that, by definition, does not incorporate the tipping point structure because the tipping point structure only becomes visible when you step outside the framework. This means that the primary danger at a tipping point is not that actors will consciously decide to cross it. It is that they will cross it while believing they are making a decision within the established pattern, a decision that the existing management architecture can absorb, because their analytical framework has not yet incorporated the recognition that the system's management capacity has been exhausted. Structural fact number 4. The tipping point in this conflict has a specific geographic and military dimension that constrains the options available to the actors involved in ways that the purely diplomatic and political analysis does not fully capture. The military situation on the ground has created facts. Supply line configurations, territorial control patterns, fortification investments, force disposition arrangements that have their own momentum and that constrain what is politically or diplomatically possible in ways that the decision makers themselves may not fully appreciate. Military facts on the ground at an advanced stage of conflict create path dependencies that are sometimes more powerful than the political intentions of the leaders who created them, because reversing those facts requires military operations whose cost and risk may exceed the political appetite for the reversal. The tipping point is therefore not purely a product of political decisions. It is also a product of the accumulated military facts that those political decisions have created. Structural fact number 5. The international community's capacity to respond to a tipping point crossing in this conflict is constrained by the same factors that have constrained its management of the conflict throughout its duration, now amplified by the additional depletion produced by the conflict's length and intensity. Sanctions architectures have been largely deployed. Military supply commitments have been largely made. Diplomatic communication channels have been largely degraded. The tools that would be available for response to a tipping point crossing are a subset of the tools that have already been employed, deployed, or exhausted in the management of the conflict to date. This means that the international response to a tipping point crossing would need to be either qualitatively different from everything that has preceded it, which requires political decisions that are currently beyond the demonstrated capacity of the relevant coalitions, or quantitatively more of the same, which has already demonstrated its limitations in the conflict's prior phases. From this point, 3 scenarios are possible. Let me walk through each with the precision this moment demands. Scenario A is the uncontrolled crossing path, the path on which the tipping point is crossed, not through a deliberate decision to escalate, but through the mechanism described in structural fact number 3, an actor making a decision within its existing analytical framework that it believes is a variation within the established pattern, while the actual state of the system means that the decision triggers the cascade that the depleted management architecture can no longer contain. This is historically the most common mechanism of tipping point crossing in major conflicts. Not deliberate escalation, but analytical failure at the moment of decision. The conditions for this scenario are currently present in ways that make it the highest probability path if the tipping point is crossed. The analytical frameworks of the key decision makers are operating within established patterns that do not incorporate the tipping point structure. The communication channels that would allow real-time recalibration as the cascade begins are degraded, and the domestic political environments constrain the space for the rapid course corrections that cascade management requires. The specific early warning signal of this scenario activating is a sequence of responses to a significant decision that escalate faster and more broadly than the decision maker who triggered the sequence anticipated, a pattern of response that reveals after the fact that the tipping point has been crossed and the cascade is underway. Scenario B is the managed navigation path, the path on which the tipping point is navigated through a combination of precise diplomatic communication, credible deterrence signaling, and the construction of a specific de-escalatory offer that gives the actor facing the most compelled decision an alternative to the escalatory path. This scenario requires a quality of decision-making and a degree of political coherence from multiple actors simultaneously that is, historically, rare at the tipping point of a major conflict. It has been achieved. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the defining example, but it required decision makers of exceptional quality operating with unusual political latitude in an information environment that, while imperfect, was significantly less degraded than the current one. The conditions for managed navigation are more difficult to assemble in the current situation than they were in that historical precedent, but they are not impossible. The specific requirement that is most critical and most uncertain is the construction of a de-escalatory offer that is simultaneously credible enough to be taken seriously, specific enough to be acted upon, and politically sustainable enough to survive the domestic pressures that will be brought to bear against it in the capitals of every actor involved. Scenario C is the structural interruption wildcard, a development that interrupts the tipping point dynamic from outside the conflict's existing actor framework in a way that reframes the decision architecture before the decisive decision is made. The most structurally plausible version of this scenario is an economic or financial development of sufficient severity to force an emergency reorientation of the key actor's priorities. A financial crisis, a commodity market dislocation, or a debt and liquidity event that makes the economic costs of continued escalation immediately and politically visible in ways that the gradual accumulation of conflict costs has not. Economic crises have historically interrupted military escalation dynamics in ways that purely diplomatic efforts could not, because they change the domestic political calculus of restraint versus escalation by making the cost of escalation immediate and tangible, rather than diffuse and incremental. Watch for the signal of this scenario in the sovereign debt markets of the countries most directly bearing the economic costs of this conflict. A significant movement in those markets would indicate that the economic interruption mechanism is activating. Let me now bring this directly home, because the tipping point and its potential consequences connect to your daily life through channels that deserve clear and specific articulation. The energy and commodity channel is the most immediate. A tipping point crossing in the escalatory direction would produce a commodity price response of a speed and magnitude that markets not currently pricing the tipping point risk are unprepared for. The gap between current commodity pricing and tipping point adjusted pricing is a measure of the unrecognized financial exposure that every household, business, and financial institution in the global economy currently carries. When the tipping point is either crossed or navigated, when the uncertainty resolves in either direction, that gap closes rapidly, in the form of either a significant price spike or a significant relief rally. The directionality of that resolution will be determined by the decisions being made right now by the actors this video has described. The financial system stability channel operates through the mechanism of correlated risk repricing. Global financial markets are currently pricing multiple risk factors, interest rate risk, credit risk, liquidity risk, without fully incorporating the tipping point risk in this conflict. When tipping point risk is correctly priced, it correlates across multiple asset classes simultaneously, which means that the financial system response to a tipping point crossing is not a contained adjustment in one market, but a correlated repricing across many markets simultaneously. Correlated repricing events are the specific category of financial market development that stress tests the architecture of the global financial system most severely because they create demands for liquidity across multiple markets at the same time that the supply of liquidity in each market is being reduced by the same risk event. The institutional and governance channel is the longest term consequence and the one whose effects will be felt most durably by the generation that inherits the international system that emerges from this conflict's resolution. A tipping point crossing in the uncontrolled escalation direction would impose damage on the international institutional architecture, the communication systems, the normative frameworks, the trust relationships between major powers that would take decades to repair and that would shape every subsequent crisis management challenge in ways that make those challenges more difficult and more dangerous than they would be in a more institutionally robust environment. The specific institutional damage of a tipping point crossing is therefore not just a cost of this conflict. It is a cost that compounds across every future crisis, every future negotiation, and every future instance in which the international community needs to manage great power disagreement without crossing into great power conflict. My read on the current moment is this. The tipping point is real. It is structurally grounded in the cumulative state of this conflict's management architecture. And the decisions that will determine which side of it the situation lands on are being made now. Not in weeks or months, but in the current decision cycle of the actors this video has described. The probability of managed navigation is not negligible, but it is lower than the public posture of the key Western governments suggests, because the conditions that managed navigation requires coherent political signaling, credible de-escalatory offers, functional communication channels, are each more difficult to assemble than they were at earlier near-threshold moments in this conflict. Short term, the critical variable to watch is the quality and specificity of the diplomatic communication happening in the channels that are not visible in the public statements. The back-channel conversations between senior officials, the intelligence channel communications between the major powers, and the specific proposals that are being explored in the intermediary diplomatic processes that operate beneath the level of the public record. Long term, the outcome of this specific tipping point will be more determinative of the shape of the international order for the next generation than any other single event currently visible on the geopolitical horizon, because it will either demonstrate that the management architecture of the international system retains the capacity to navigate threshold moments in major conflicts, or it will demonstrate that it does not, with consequences that cascade through every subsequent crisis that the international system is asked to manage. One decision, one actor, one moment at which the pressure that has been building through the entire arc of this conflict either finds a managed release or crosses the threshold into something that the existing management architecture cannot contain. That is the situation. It is not comfortable to describe with clarity, but clarity is what the moment requires, and clarity is what this channel is built to provide. Do not follow the surface of the story. Follow the structural pressure underneath it. Follow the depletion of the management architecture, the convergence of the domestic political constraints, and the quality of the decision-making in the channels where the decisive communication is happening. Because those factors, not any headline, not any press conference, not any official statement, are what will determine which side of this tipping point the world wakes up on. If you want to continue receiving this kind of precise structural analysis before the events that confirm it have occurred, please like this video and subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so the next analysis reaches you when it matters most. News changes fast. Structures change slow. Know the difference. And that is precisely what we are here for.